Hi, I'm Mike Ingram. I'm another one of the Barrelhouse editors. I teach at Temple in Philadelphia, and I guess I'm also a fiction writer. So I was asked to talk about fiction and about point of view, and I was trying to think of things that would be applicable, I guess, for people of sort of different levels and maybe coming from different places. This will mostly be about fiction, but I hope it's, at least some of it, applicable to poetry as well, for those of you who are poets. And Dan and Revius can feel free to chime in on poetry things if things occur to you that are like this. So when I teach writing classes, like I said, I teach at Temple, and in my fiction classes, my students get really, really tired of hearing me talk about point of view. Actually, we're halfway through the semester, and somebody the other day told me that I was obsessed with point of view. I don't know if that was meant as a compliment exactly, but I feel like writers are maybe obsessive about things, and being obsessive about point of view is maybe not the worst thing to be obsessive about. It's just something I guess I spend a lot of time thinking about, and that as both an editor and a teacher, I sort of wish other people spent as much time thinking about. I feel like there's a tendency, and this is not true for everyone, but you see a lot of stories where I think people tend to write sort of first person because that feels comfortable, or you write in the third person because that seems comfortable. And at some point, I feel like some thought needs to go into sort of what that point of view choice is. I guess to back up, I tend to view writing in general as a series of choices. I mean, I think that's a popular view. That with any story, you have a writer constantly making choices, and those choices are changeable and revisable. I think sometimes as readers, we don't tend to think of fiction that way because things seem very inevitable. I mean, of course, in Dennis Johnson's Emergency, Georgie pulls the knife out of that guy's eye who stumbles into the emergency room. Madame Bovary, of course, poisons herself. That seems like this very sort of inevitable thing. Of course that would happen. Because I think if a writer's doing their job, of course those things seem inevitable, but they don't have to happen. Those are all choices that the writer is making. And so I think point of view is really the first kind of fundamental choice that you have to make with a piece of fiction. And I suppose that's probably true for poetry, right? Yes?
Yes.
So I feel like it's a thing people could think about. Whether that thinking happens before the drafting stage or sometime later, But I think there are certain, benefits and drawbacks to various points of view. And today we're going to focus on first person, but I think this is true for all sorts of points of view. That it's just such a fundamental choice. I think if the point of view in a story is right, then sort of everything flows from that point of view. And I also think point of view is more complicated than people sort of give it credit for. If you take a creative writing class, well, not mine, I guess, because I tend to be obsessed about point of view, as I said, but I think you typically get the quick rundown of, okay, there's first person, and then you have sort of third person limited, in which you're kind of strapped to one particular character, and you have third person omniscient, and okay, now let's move on and talk about other stuff. But the truth is, I think those things exist on a pretty wide continuum. If you think about, we're going to talk about first person mostly, but if you think about third person as an example, there's a lot of stuff between third person omniscient and third person limited. I mean, there's sort of a million versions of those points of view. There's actually not a ton of third person omniscient. It's sort of oddly old fashioned, I think. But an example, I guess, Richard Yates's Revolutionary Road is a great sort of case study in how the omniscient voice can work. That book only works because it's in a very particular kind of omniscient voice where you basically have these unlikable characters. I mean, they're sometimes likable in a kind of sad sack way, but mostly pretty unlikable. And the way that book functions is that we're allowed as readers to kind of, not exactly mock them, but judge them a little. I mean, the narrator of that book is sort of judging them in this subtle way. And I think without that, that book would just be a book about unlikable people that nobody would really like. And in fact, I think that's kind of why I don't know if anyone saw the movie of that book, but I feel like the movie largely didn't work because it's hard to do that in film. The movie was kind of about fairly unlikable people just sort of moving around and saying things. And it lost the kind of dark humor of the novel, which is the narrator sort of subtly commenting on all the sort of unlikable things that these characters did. And then if you go down the other end of the spectrum, there are third-person kind of limited stories in which you're sort of far away from the main character. There are third-person limited stories in which you're so close that it's almost like a first person. That you're so close to that character's consciousness that bits of that character's language and the way they think about things are seeping in. And I feel like along that spectrum, all those choices matter. One thing that I do sometimes in my fiction classes is with the undergrads is to tell them to take something they've written and switch the point of view. And there's always one kid, it does seem to always be a guy, I don't know why, who either out of laziness or being a smart aleck just does the find replace move, where like they change all the he's to I or all the I's to he. And the sad thing about that, well, there are many sad things about that, but one of the sad things about that is that sometimes that actually doesn't, it kind of works. And I feel like if that works, then you're not really exploiting point of view, right? Like if you can that easily change the point of view of a story, you're not really thinking through the possibilities of point of view. Because I think it should be a lot more deeply ingrained than just the pronouns that you're using. So to talk some about first person, I guess I can sort of throw this out to the audience a bit. I'm just curious, I mean, when you're writing or starting something, sort of what the process of point of view is like. If any of you have some sort of process you follow or a sense of why you might write in the first person as opposed to third or second or I don't know what other possibility there would be. But, anyone have ideas about that? Or what the advantages of first person might be? Yeah.
I think for some reason point of view seems to come out of the free write for me, and I just kind of go with that during the free write. Sometimes I'll go back and I might rewrite first paragraph or a different paragraph in a different point of view to see how it feels, try it on, and see if I'm going to go a different direction, and if it works, great. If not, I stick with my original.
Okay. Other people have things they do?
The more strong-willed my main character is, the tougher the first-person point of view becomes for me. And more, you were talking about comfort level before, and the more cloying and arrogant that position, because you're always acting out your characters, you know. And so that's one of the challenges. I think that if I were to look and do a division here, I'd say that my first-person narrators are almost often really quite obviously weak and vulnerable for some reason.
So what is it about those more willful characters that makes you not want to have them be in the first person?
I think that when they're clever, I've become annoyed with them. I think
That's interesting.
it's probably not useful though.
What's that?
That's probably not useful though.
No, I mean, I think that's interesting. I mean, it seems like you're really thinking about it,
critical.
which I think is good, you know.
It's about critical distance, actually. It's about, you know, it's easier to observe that someone else is clever than to allow a character to say, look at how clever I am.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, but I do think some of the first-person stories I like the best have kind of, I guess I wouldn't say necessarily like weak characters, but maybe characters who are a little inarticulate or maybe not quite so clever. So yeah, that's an interesting idea. Other people have ideas?
I run into the problem of the characters are too passive. First person, everything else is happening out there, and they're just sort of like watching things. And then if I do it in third person, I get kind of annoyed with that. I'm like, do something.
Yeah, yeah.
So
yeah, I had a writing professor in grad school who had sort of two pieces of advice about passive characters, and one was, well, the obvious one, which is to not let them be passive. You know, to put them in a situation where they have to react. I mean, I guess the ridiculous example of that would be like all of a sudden somebody gets attacked by a lion, but like, you know, it doesn't have to be that sort of thing. But that if you have a character who is, as a lot of people are, kind of passive, I mean, I don't want to speak for other people in the room, but I feel like people in general, and especially writers, tend to like, you know, not want to have a lot of conflict. I mean, we like to get along with people, and that's sort of great in life, but not so great in fiction. So yeah, it's like there's some way that another character, right, can put pressure on them. So then you feel like that's easier in third person.
yeah, but like in student stories too, you get the narrator that's just so sensitive, and everybody else is so horrible, and they get it, and they understand life and love, and everybody else is kind of a shithead. So that's, yeah.
And then the other piece of advice that person had was, anytime you have a character saying to themselves, and I guess this would mostly apply in first person, that they sort of wish they could do something or they thought about doing something, especially something rather inappropriate, to actually rewrite that so that the character does that thing. You know, like I think there's a tendency in writing where, you know, you're writing a conversation between people and it's like, I wanted to tell them to shut the hell up or something. And it's like, well, why don't you just let the character do that, right? And then all of a sudden there is conflict and stuff happening. Other thoughts about sort of how you go about picking point of view?
I end up writing in third person almost exclusively. And I think one of my frustrations that I get with first person is just the basic like logistics of like character movement and like plot. So, and now I'm going to walk to the store. It just seems so like it seems so like false, and I just can't. It doesn't seem seem natural when I'm writing, whereas I guess in third person it can be more dictatorial about it.
Yeah, yeah. You can be the god of the story.
That sort of stuff trips me out when I'm trying to do it first person.
And I find with my students that a lot of them write in first person almost by default, and I don't really know what that's about. Except that it's comfortable for people. Maybe it's like the age of Facebook and tweeting or something. Like we're used to talking about ourselves in the first person a lot, but I don't know. But it seems like this natural default, and then I feel like they're not really exploiting what you could get out of the first person. So I try to come up with a list of a few, I guess we could call these potentials and pitfalls of first person. Just to try to, give you, I guess, something to think about. And obviously I have examples, I have some props, like Carrot Top or something. So I may periodically shuffle through my pile of books to try to find something to read. So in terms of the sort of potentials of first person, I think the first one is sort of obvious, which is voice. That really if you're going to write in first person, that's sort of the first thing to think about exploiting. Presumably, if part of most people's impulse towards writing has to do with language, that you sort of enjoy the musicality of language, and first person is this great way to exploit that. There's ways that it can sometimes be overexploited, perhaps, but I think it's a good starting place. And it's a great way of characterizing someone, like everybody sort of talks differently, everybody has their sort of tics and kinds of things they say, and even things they talk about. There's a way that sometimes in the first person, besides just the way people are talking, you can have characters be a little unhinged. Like they can kind of have weird progressions of thought, and they can talk the way my composition students write, like weird, disjointed, ideas that don't necessarily seem to fit together, but that give you this insight into like how that character's brain is working. And so I think, that's sort of the first thing, is to think about sort of what you can do with voice. And so I have an example. This is maybe an unlikely thing to read from in a fiction class. This is, if anybody has not read this, I would definitely recommend it. It's this book called The Dirt about Motley Crue. I know Dave will definitely second my recommendation. This book is awesome. And it's not just awesome because Motley Crue is sort of over the top and ridiculous, although that is largely why it's awesome. It's actually really well written, and in kind of an interesting way. Like, it was written with a guy whose name I can't seem to find on the cover. But it's like an alternating series of first-person kind of accounts. And I think the writer just did an incredible job of capturing all the people's voices and letting them sort of speak. But I'm sure did some editing too to kind of clean things up and make them a little more coherent, possibly. But I just think the voice of these people comes through. And nonfiction, I think, can be a great kind of inspiration for especially first-person fiction writing to actually hear how people talk. So I was just going to read this little bit of, this is I guess one of the first chapters from Mick, who was, I think, guitarist, right? Dave would know this. Mick was the guitarist, right? The older guy?
Mick Mars?
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is Mick Mars, who's, I guess the background of this is that he's a bit older than everybody else in the band when it starts, and he's a little bit of like the curmudgeonly old guy who doesn't really like to party with them. So this is his first section. I used to tell them, you know what your problem is? When you do stuff, you get caught. This is the way you do stuff. Then I took a shot glass and threw it across the room, and nobody knew what the fuck was going on. I've always been the one who knows how to do things like that and not get caught. I guess I was the outsider. I had this place in Manhattan Beach with my girlfriend. I was never into hanging out at that house with the other guys. I had done that, seen it. I'd been over 21 for a long time, and they were still like 18. I came over once for Christmas, and they had a small tree they'd stolen and decorated with beer cans, panties, snot, and needles. Before we left for a gig at the country club that night, they put the tree in the courtyard, doused it with gasoline, and set it on fire. They thought it was real funny, but to me it just stank. That kind of stuff bored me really quickly, It was always so filthy over there that you could wipe your finger on any surface and get dirt under your nails. I'd rather stay home and drink and bang on my guitar. Nikki was going out with some kind of witch who he'd have sex with in the closet or in a coffin in her house. Tommy was going out with, I can't remember her name, but we called her Bullwinkle, and a moose is not a very pretty animal. She'd go crazy and rip fire extinguishers off the walls and bust through windows to get into the house. To me, she was a dumb, young, possessive personality that was crazy or something. I could never get as violent as that, shatter a window and run the risk of hurting myself. What's on the inside of people like that is stuff that's a little too much for me. Everyone likes to look for aliens, but I think we're the aliens. We're the descendants of the troublemakers on other planets. Just like Australia was a prison to England where they sent all their criminals and so on, it's the same thing on Earth. This is where they dropped us off. We're the insane fucking people from somewhere else, just a bunch of trash. I just think that's interesting. I feel like the voice is compelling, but it's also, like, that's a thing that first-person characters can do, right? Is just go on weird rants. Like, there's sort of no reason to start talking about aliens, But you can do that in the first person. Like, it doesn't have to add up, and it sort of characterizes the person and tells us things about them. So number one, I think, is voice. I mean, that's really one of the reasons to write in first person. The second thing, I think, is dramatic irony, which, you know, is basically just a fancy way of saying that the reader sort of knows things that the character doesn't know. You know, there's a way that you can sort of see around the narrator of a first person story, that maybe they're telling you one thing over and over again, but you really can tell that either that's not quite true or they don't quite believe it. You sort of can learn things about them that sort of they don't know yet about themselves. A great source for this is to look at personal ads online. This is another thing I sometimes have my students do. I mean, for one thing, they're kind of funny. I guess I feel mean saying this because you're sort of spying on people's lives, but people tend to not be very good about writing about themselves. You know, like if you go and look at what people write in online personals, you'll notice sort of a bunch of cliches, a bunch of kind of meaningless things that you see so much that they kind of, you know, they become sort of nothing. Which is also sort of a great lesson because you can take note of the things that actually stand out, that actually make you feel like you get a sense of that person. And then the other thing that's interesting about it is the way that you can kind of read things into what people say. Like when I had my students do this a few weeks ago, somebody came in and they were like, oh my god, I saw this ad, and this guy was like, seemed really normal and was sort of talking about himself, and then all of a sudden he said his pet peeve was liars, and he went on for like 2 paragraphs about how he hates liars, and how he doesn't want to meet any more liars, and it was like so obvious that like somebody really screwed this guy over really, really recently. Like he clearly had this chip on his shoulder. And I think that's another thing that you can do with first-person stories, is that there can be this kind of dramatic irony between what the character understands about themselves and what you, the reader, can understand about them. Because most of us tend to not be particularly articulate when sort of writing about ourselves or talking about ourselves. And so I think characters can be the same way. I think I had an example of that too. Oh yeah, so this is from the story collection You're Not a Stranger Here by Adam Hazlitt, which came out several years ago. And the first story in the collection I think is really great. It's written in the first-person voice of this sort of older character who ends up going and visiting his gay son and lover. But I think the voice is sort of great at the beginning. It's called Notes to My Biographer, and it starts, 2 things to get straight from the beginning. I hate doctors and have never joined a support group in my life. At 73, I'm not about to change. The mental health establishment can go screw itself on a barren hilltop in the rain before I touch their snake oil or listen to the visionless chatter of men half my age. I've shot Germans in the fields of Normandy, filed 26 patents, married 3 women, survived them all, and am currently the subject of an investigation by the IRS, which has about as much chance of collecting from me as Shylock did of getting his pound of flesh. Bureaucracies have trouble thinking clearly. I, on the other hand, am perfectly lucid. Note, for instance, how I obtained the Saab I'm presently driving into the Los Angeles basin. A niece in Scottsdale lent it to me. Do you think she'll ever see it again? Unlikely. Of course, when I borrowed it from her, I had every intention of returning it, and in a few days or weeks I may feel that way again, but for now forget her and her husband and 3 children who looked at me over the kitchen table like I was a museum piece sent to bore them. I could run circles around those kids. They're spoon-fed Ritalin in private schools and have eyes that say, give me things I don't have. I wanted to read them a book on the history of the world, its migrations, plagues, and wars, but the shelves of their outsized condominium were full of ceramics and biographies of the stars. The whole thing depressed the hell out of me, and I'm glad to be gone. And throughout the story, I mean, I think we begin to see around that sort of narrator. I mean, even from the beginning, like, I feel like that line that, you know, he's perfectly sane and reasonable is pretty clearly not true. And so I think that's another thing, like I said, that you can do with the first person, is sort of see around the character. It's also a good way to actually withhold information. I mean, there's a way that in a third-person story, withholding information can seem kind of coy. It's like, if a character withholds information, that's sort of okay. But if the story or the writer withholds information, I think we kind of feel like the writer's a jerk. You know, if everybody in the story and the writer knows something, and the reader is the only one not in on that, that becomes sort of frustrating and annoying. But so in a first-person story, you know, it can be like one of those old Columbo episodes where, like, you sort of solve the crime, like, while Columbo solves the crime. I mean, it doesn't have to be that sort of obvious plot thing, but, you know, I think there are all sorts of things that we can discover along with the narrator. So that's the second pro, I think, of first person. And the third and final one I came up with, I'm not really sure what the word for this is, maybe insight or sort of wisdom, hindsight. It can be kind of a strength or weakness, but I think point of view isn't just about who's telling a story, but from what distance they're telling the story. And so another sort of decision you have to make in a first-person story is whether you're writing a story that's sort of unfolding as it's being told, or whether you're writing a story that, like, I guess the cliche would be that, like, the old guy's sitting on the porch in the rocking chair, telling his grandkids about something that happened years ago. So there can be various sorts of distances that a narrator can have. And I think that can also be a strength of a first-person story, that not only can the narrator tell us the story, but can offer some kind of insight into what the story means. Like I said, that can be a pitfall, because I think what you want to avoid is the sort of Wonder Years voiceover effect, which, I don't know, I assume people here might be familiar. I always use that in my class, and I get blank stares, because, like, college kids who are 20 have no idea what the hell the Wonder Years are, and then they just think I'm old. But, in the Wonder Years, they always had the sort of moment where, who's the guy that did the voice on that show?
Daniel Stern.
Yeah, so Daniel Stern would come on, in the voice of Kevin Arnold and be like, and that's the day I realized that my brother was also a real person or something. Or like, and then I realized that Dad worked really hard. And it's always this sort of obvious thing that we've figured out already.
You can map that over Dexter.
What's that?
You can do the same thing with Dexter.
Oh, I've never seen that show. They have the same thing?
Yeah, he's a serial killer now.
Is it good? I thought people liked that show though. Is it good in the show?
But he does the same sort of voiceover thing.
Oh, really?
He has the same sort of realization at the end. It's quite fun. Sorry.
And so, no, I mean, I think some of that is good, and then some of it is sort of obvious, right? Like, you sort of figured out at that point what the realization is. I mean, people don't like getting hit over the head with things, like, it's sort of painful and terrible, both literally and, I guess, metaphorically in stories. So, that could be the pitfall, but I think there are maybe subtle ways of doing it, of having kind of a retrospective narrator. So I have a couple examples of that, too. Let's see. One of them is, I mentioned Dennis Johnson's Emergency, which I think people have read that story, maybe, right? I feel like the story always gets taught and talked about and whatever. One of the things that I think is great about the story, among many things, aside from the fact that it's just kind of insane, is that for several pages in the story, we're basically in a kind of present narrative. I mean, it's in the past tense, but it's that kind of past tense of this stuff is just sort of happening as we're being told about it. And then suddenly, kind of maybe midway or even past midway in the story, we get this little paragraph in the middle of a scene that just says, that was the year when Arctic clouds moved down over the Midwest and we had 2 weeks of winter in September. And so there's this sort of light goes off, in the reader's head that's like, like, this is somebody telling the story from some future time. But subtle, I mean, it's a sort of small, subtle thing. Then I think we go a couple more pages where we're sort of back to just present action. If I can find the next one. I thought there was one in between. Oh yeah, so then we're kind of, if you haven't read the story, both characters do a bunch of drugs and drive around and they end up running over some rabbits and then the rabbits die. It's actually kind of horrifying. And so then we get this line in the middle of that scene that just says, or maybe that wasn't the time it snowed. Maybe it was the time we slept in the truck and I rolled over on the bunnies and flattened them. It doesn't matter. What's important for me to remember now is that early the next morning the snow was melted off the windshield and the daylight woke me up. And again, it's like this small, subtle thing, but you get kind of nostalgia or something. I mean, you also learn that I guess this is an unreliable narrator, right? Like, this person might not actually remember what happened, which I guess is understandable given the amount of pills that in the present action of the story, the character is chewed up with sort of no regard for what kind of pills they are. But so we get a sense that this is somebody looking back, and so then I think you start to ask yourself, well, why is the character looking back at this particular day? And then at the very end, we get, I think, the only other sort of moment of reflection, which is the second to last paragraph, where the narrator says, that world, those days, or these days, it's all been erased and they've rolled it up like a scroll and put it away somewhere. Yes, I can touch it with my fingers, but where is it? And that's really all the sort of retrospectiveness in that story, but it's enough to sort of tell you where the narrator is in space and time, and to kind of soak everything with this sort of weird nostalgia. I mean, it's an odd thing to be nostalgic for, the night that you took a bunch of pills and drove around and ran over some bunnies and got lost in the middle of a snowstorm. But there's like this kind of nostalgia that, the character has for maybe like his crazy days or those kind of unhinged times. So again, I think there's ways that you can sort of work in that retrospectiveness subtly. The other example that I thought of for that is the Raymond Carver story Feathers, which I don't know if people have read. But this story is actually, I mean, the whole thing is basically taking place more or less present action. I mean, again, it's in the past tense, but it's this whole episode where the main character, the narrator, goes to dinner at his coworker's house with his wife, and they sort of meet each other's families, and the woman, or I guess the couple that they go to eat, the couple whose house they go to owns a peacock, which sort of just walks all around their house. and freaks them out. And it just is kind of this day of, this stuff happens. And then suddenly at the end of the story, it takes this kind of weird turn where I guess, so they get home from that night and they sleep together because she wants to get pregnant. And then we get this line, later after things had changed for us and the kid had come along, all of that, Fran would look back on that evening at Bud's place as the beginning of the change. But she's wrong. The change came later, and when it came, it was like something that happened to other people, not something that could have happened to us. God damn those people and their ugly baby, Fran will say, for no apparent reason while we're watching TV late at night. And that smelly bird, she'll say. Christ, who needs it? She says this kind of stuff a lot, even though she hasn't seen Bud and Alla since that one time. Fran doesn't work at the creamery anymore, and she cut her hair a long time ago. She's gotten fat on me, too. We don't talk about it. What's to say? I still see Bud at the plant. We work together, and we open our lunch pails together. If I ask, he tells me about Alla and Harold. Joey's out of the picture. He flew into his tree one night, and that was it for him. He didn't come down. Old age, maybe. Then the owls took over. Bud shrugs. He eats his sandwich and says Harold's going to be a linebacker someday. You ought to see that kid, Bud says. Once in a blue moon, he asks about my family. When he does, I tell him everybody's fine. Everybody's fine, I say. I close the lunch pail and take out my cigarettes. Bud nods and sips his coffee. The truth is, my kid has a conniving streak in him, but I don't talk about it. Not even with his mother, especially her. She and I talk less and less as it is. And it sort of goes on to talk about his present life. But I feel like it's a stronger sense of looking back, but again, it's this kind of like how things add up since. I like that the narrator there sort of tells us, that was when the change happened, but it's not exactly hitting you over the head with like, that was the day that our marriage fell apart or something. It's this kind of, it's more suggestive, I guess. And I think that's one of the pleasures of reading is that, the writer sort of implies things and the reader infers things, and there's this sort of pleasurable thing of adding that stuff up. So I think that's another kind of cool thing you can do with the first person. In terms of pitfalls, well, I guess voice. I know I said voice is a strength, but I think it can be a weakness too. I think Dave would agree with me from an editorial standpoint that like people maybe shouldn't write in dialect, for instance. I don't know, it just tends to be offensive, even if you're trying really hard to not be offensive.
It gets a little fast.
And it's it's like with any rule with writing. There's ways it can work, but 9 times out of 10, it's like not so much. And I think voice can be this great engaging way to get a reader into the story, but sometimes it can't really carry a story, Like I think, because you were saying you sort of feel like with the first person, it doesn't go anywhere sometimes. And I think that's kind of sometimes the thing. It's like you have this great voice, and there's a tendency then for the narrator to just kind of ramble on, and no story really happens. And so I think the fix for that is, one would be to think about changing the point of view if that's happening. But I guess the other choice could be, making a story happen. Like I was saying, make some other character confront the narrator in some way. Or just push on the voice even more until it becomes really interesting. There are ways that, as much as voice is hard to carry, it's hard for a voice to carry a story. There are cases where that does happen. So, pushing on the voice and maybe making it even more interesting, or just introducing more story. Like in that Dennis Johnson story, there's all kinds of dialogue and scene and stuff happening, and so there's no reason that stuff can't happen in a first-person story. I guess the sort of related pitfall is like the telling versus showing thing, that sometimes in a first-person story, there's this tendency to just tell the reader everything, and to not have scene and not have sort of things develop. But you can just have some scenes, right? Write some scenes in there, write some dialogue. Put some other characters in there. And then I think sometimes you can kind of lose perspective, I think, in a first-person story, or objectivity. If you're so close to a narrator, as the reader, we sometimes have no sense of what the objective reality of the world is. And I think the fix for that is just, again, to put more characters in there. There's a great sort of first-person story move, which is to put another character in there that can be a kind of stand-in for the reader. That can ask the narrator questions that we want to ask the narrator, or can call him on his bullshit or whatever, and that we can then identify with and go, oh, okay, so this guy is kind of crazy. In that Adam Hazlitt story, eventually that character comes into contact with several other people, and I think we kind of figure out that it's the other people who are sane and not him, within those disagreements. We kind of get these stand-ins for ourselves. And then the final pitfall that I came up with, this might sound really nitpicky, but the repetition of the first-person pronoun can actually be a problem, I think, in first-person stories. Second person too, that you just get so many eyes on the page that just rhythmically, I don't want to step on the poet's toes here by talking about language that closely, but I mean, I think just the rhythm of it can be a little obsessive or too much. But I think the fix to that is that you just try to write out as many of the eyes as you can. Even in small, sort of simple ways. You know, there's this tendency to write things like, I looked over at Robert combing his hair. You know, why not just write, Robert was combing his hair, right? I mean, it's a first person story, like we get it, that the first person eye is the one who's seen everything. And so I think this is my final example from these things. Because I found this story, thinking about first person made me think about this Rick DeMarina story. And I actually, because I guess I am kind of obsessive, I actually counted the words. And this story goes 215 words before it actually uses the first person pronoun, which I found kind of impressive. It starts, the Dagmans were untidy degenerates, including their children and pets, according to Mom. Some people make their pets and children as trashy as they are, she said, her voice hushed discreetly. It's a well-known fact of life. She used me in my crisp blue Air Force uniform, I guess it does use me, complete with expert marksman medal and good conduct ribbon, and our dog Pershing as counterexamples. Pershing was a joyless yellow Labrador. We kept him tied to the mulberry tree in our front yard. He never barked or strained at his rope when cars or people on foot passed by. He was too intelligent, too dignified to be ruled by the ordinary chaotic dog emotions. Several of the undisciplined Dagman dogs would often come over to visit Pershing, and Pershing would allow himself to be sniffed, nipped, teased, and sometimes mounted without protest until Mom rapped the window hard enough to make the uninhibited Dagman mongrels realize her anger. The motley gang of dogs would then chase each other back across the street to their house, which looked like it had been plucked up out of some 1930s Dust Bowl state by a tornado and deposited 20 years later in our clean and tidy, middle-class, scrupulously manicured East San Diego neighborhood. I had just gotten back home after 12 weeks of basic training at Parks Air Force Base, and so that's the first sort of first-person pronoun. But it's clearly in the first person. And I just think there's ways to go through, I mean, I would just say if you write a first-person story, like go through the draft and see how many of the eyes you can take out. Because some of them are unnecessary, and it does build up this kind of weird rhythm, I think, when there's too many. So I think that's my rambling stuff. I thought that we could do some writing, since that's probably enough of me talking for a while. And so my suggestion for our sort of writing activity that has to do with first person is to actually do some letter writing. This is the thing that I do sometimes with my students, and I feel like beyond it, obviously being in the first person, when you're writing a letter, there's an audience, and that somehow just creates a kind of energy or like immediacy to a thing. And I just think letter writing in general can be a great sort of fiction start. You know, even if you end up not writing a story in letter form and drop it at some point, it's like a way in because you're actually talking to somebody specifically. And even in like a longer work, you know, I think a lot of novels, there are sort of, you know, bit like letters get sort of dropped in and could be these kind of great little details. Even as kind of experimental things, like I sometimes suggested to people, if you're writing a story and you get kind of stuck and you're just trying to figure out a character, like have that character write some letters, you know, even if those are not going to end up being in the story, like have them write some like complaining letters to the editor or something, or like, you know, the Grandpa Simpson like letters to various magazines complaining about things, or letters to, you know, dead relatives or whatever. So my suggestion, and I guess you don't have to follow this, I mean, it's not like there's really rules, but is to write a letter to a person that the letter writer either has never met or has not seen in a really long time, and to somewhere in there have the letter writer confess to something, like for that to sort of be the purpose of the letter, even if it takes a little bit to sort of build up to that, or if he doesn't quite want to confess. But you know, there's a free writing, I mean, you can, I guess, do whatever you want. And then I thought, Dave, if we have time, are we going to have, if people want to read stuff out loud, that could be cool, so we can get some other voices in here other than ours.
A little bit, like not everybody, whoever wants.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a requirement, but so that's sort of my spiel. I guess before we do the writing, if people have any questions or other things, like, I don't know what you have questions about, but if there are things that, I don't know, you want to clarify or whatever. Otherwise, I will give you some time to write. Does that sound right, Dave?
Mm-hmm. So how long do you want to give, like 15, 20 minutes?
Yeah, that seems fair.
You said this was like a hands-on workshop.
Yeah,
thing.
we'll all sit silently and scrawl things.
What?
We'll all sit silently and scrawl things. And then if some people want to read, that would be awesome.
All right, so let's say like 20 minutes.